The door slammed open so hard that the wooden frame of my cabin rattled, and I almost dropped the mug of coffee I was holding. Standing there was a woman I had already heard about from my neighbors, the infamous HOA president everyone referred to as Karen. She was exactly how they had described her, short blonde hair perfectly styled as if she was heading to a fashion show instead of storming into someone's home, oversized sunglasses pushed up on her head even though we were indoors, and an attitude that radiated entitlement. She didn't knock, she didn't call ahead, she didn't even hesitate before barging into my cabin as if she owned the place. Her arms were crossed, lips pressed into a thin line, and eyes darting around the room like she was inspecting every corner for a violation. My neighbors had warned me that she thought she was queen of the lake, but this was something else entirely. I had moved into this cabin only 2 weeks ago, looking for peace and quiet after years of high-stress work in the city. The lake was supposed to be my escape, a place where I could listen to the water lap gently against the dock, enjoy the smell of pine trees in the morning air, and finally take a deep breath without feeling like I was under constant pressure. But instead of peace, I was already dealing with the self-appointed ruler of the community. The cabin was supposed to be my safe space, my retreat. I had purchased it fair and square, no HOA approval required, and the property records proved it. But Karen didn't care about facts. To her, everything within a 5-mile radius fell under her rule. She had built a reputation for terrorizing homeowners with absurd demands, banning garden gnomes, threatening fines over mailbox colors, even sending letters about curtains that weren't the approved shade of beige. People told me that she patrolled the neighborhood like a guard dog, snapping photos of violations, and handing out fines like candy. I thought if I kept my head down and stayed out of her way, she'd leave me alone. Clearly, I was wrong. The worst part was that this wasn't just any morning. Today, I had a very important guest sitting at my table. A man who didn't waste words and carried himself with the kind of quiet authority you only see in people who have dealt with far bigger problems than HOA drama. We were sitting across from each other, sipping coffee, and reviewing some very private documents. I had planned for a calm, focused morning of discussion, but now Karen had blown that plan apart by storming in like a hurricane. "What do you think you're doing here?" she barked, her voice loud enough to echo against the wooden beams of the ceiling. "This property falls under HOA rules. You can't just move in without my approval. And what's this?" She gestured to the folders on the table as if she had the right to inspect them. I slowly set down my mug, my jaw tightening, and exchanged a glance with my guest. He raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable, but I could tell he was waiting to see how I would handle this situation. He wasn't the type to jump in without reason, but his presence alone carried weight. "Karen," I said evenly, forcing myself to keep my tone calm, "you're trespassing." She ignored me, walking further inside as if my words meant nothing. She scanned the bookshelves, the fireplace, the table, even the rug on the floor, as though she was making a mental list of things to fine me for. Finally, she planted her hands on her hips, glaring at me like a judge handing down a sentence. "You can't just have unapproved guests in this community," she snapped. "All meetings need to be cleared through the HOA. That's the rule." I almost laughed out loud. "That's not a rule, Karen. You just made that up." My guest leaned back slightly, studying her with calm, watchful eyes. He didn't need to say anything yet, his silence was powerful enough. Karen, of course, didn't notice. She was too busy puffing herself up, too convinced that she had authority over me. She jabbed her finger toward the folders on the table again. "And what's this? What kind of business are you running here? I'll have you know that commercial activity is strictly prohibited in residential cabins." She said it with the confidence of someone who thought she was untouchable. That's when my guest moved for the first time. Without a word, he slid the folders out of her reach, his hand steady, deliberate. His calm presence instantly shifted the energy in the room. Karen blinked, thrown off for just a moment, then quickly tried to recover. "And who exactly are you?" she demanded, narrowing her eyes at him. He didn't answer right away, and that pause was enough to unsettle her. I could see it in the way her stance shifted, the faint flicker of hesitation in her eyes. It was the first crack in her armor of arrogance. "Karen," I said again, my voice low but firm, "you don't belong here. You need to leave." But instead of backing down, she turned on me again. "Don't you tell me where I belong. I am the president of this HOA, and I decide what goes on in this community. If I say this meeting is not allowed, then it's not allowed." She lifted her chin, her voice trembling slightly with the force of her own conviction. My guest finally spoke. His voice was calm, smooth, and steady, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. "That's not how this works." Karen froze for half a second, her eyes locking on him, and for the first time since she barged in, she seemed unsure. She opened her mouth as if to fire back another demand, but then she looked closer at him. Recognition flickered across her face. Her confident smirk faltered. She blinked, squinting at him, and her hand slowly dropped from her hip. "Wait a minute," she stammered. You're," but she couldn't finish the sentence. My guest simply leaned back, folded his arms, and said one word in reply, his tone even but firm. "Yes." That one word was enough to knock the wind out of her sails. For the first time, Karen, the woman who thought she ruled the entire lake, looked rattled. And she had no idea just how deep of a hole she had just stepped into by barging into my cabin. Karen's mouth opened and closed like she was searching for words that wouldn't come out, her usual sharpness suddenly dulled by the heavy silence in the room. She had walked into the cabin expecting to intimidate me, maybe even humiliate me in front of what she assumed was just another neighbor or perhaps some contractor. But instead, she was standing face to face with a man who was not only calm and composed but carried an aura of authority that made it impossible to ignore him. My guest was no ordinary visitor. He was someone Karen should have feared the most, a state investigator whose current assignment was to review community complaints about abusive HOAs across the region. I had invited him to my cabin because it was neutral ground, away from the eyes of the very people he was investigating, and quiet enough for us to discuss sensitive matters without interruption. At least, that was the plan before Karen barged in. I could almost see the wheels turning in her head as recognition set in. She had likely read about him or maybe even seen his name in the letters that had been circulating in our community, warning HOAs about investigations into misuse of power. Her confidence wavered, but she tried to recover. She forced out a laugh that sounded dry and brittle. "Oh. I didn't realize you were here on, official business. I was just checking in, making sure everything was in compliance." My guest didn't even blink. He simply slid the folders closer to himself, away from her prying eyes, and tapped his pen against the table with steady rhythm. "Compliance," he repeated, his voice low but edged with something sharp. "Because from what I've read, compliance in this community seems to mean whatever you decide it does, regardless of the bylaws." Karen bristled, puffing herself up again. "Excuse me? I'm the president of this HOA. My job is to protect property values and maintain standards. If I don't enforce rules, this entire neighborhood will go downhill. I'm the only one keeping things in order." She raised her chin, her voice trembling slightly with the effort to sound confident. I couldn't hold my tongue. "Order, Karen. Or control. Because what you call rules are nothing more than demands you invent on the spot. Last week you told my neighbor he couldn't put a bird feeder on his porch. Yesterday you left a note on my door about the color of my curtains. Now you're barging into my home claiming meetings have to be registered with you. None of that is in the bylaws." Karen's head snapped toward me, her eyes blazing with the kind of anger only people drunk on power can muster. "Don't you dare lecture me about bylaws. I know them better than anyone. And you," she pointed her finger straight at my guest now, her voice shaking, "you have no authority to interfere in community business. This is private property, governed by private rules. That was the moment the investigator set his pen down, folded his hands on the table, and looked directly at her. His eyes were calm, but his stare was unshakable. Karen, I think you know exactly who I am. And you also know why I'm here. I've received more than a dozen complaints about your behavior. Reports of harassment, intimidation, excessive and unlawful fines, and even accusations of misusing HOA funds. Would you like to explain those to me? Karen's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. Finally, she stammered, that's nonsense. Lies. These people just don't like following rules. They complain because I won't let them run wild. I'm only doing my duty. I leaned forward, unable to stay silent. Is it your duty to threaten fines for kids leaving bikes on the driveway? To shout at families for having barbecues past 8 o'clock? To storm into my cabin uninvited and start rifling through my papers? Because that looks less like duty and more like harassment. Karen snapped her head back toward me, glaring, but the confidence in her eyes was gone. She was floundering, and she knew it. The investigator picked up his pen again, jotting notes onto his pad without breaking eye contact with her. The sound of his pen scratching against paper seemed to grow louder in the silence. Karen, he said slowly, walking into a private residence without permission is trespassing. Interrupting an ongoing state review could be considered obstruction. I strongly suggest you choose your next words carefully. Her bravado cracked. She sputtered, You can't be serious. I was only trying to ensure everything was within standards. Standards, he repeated, almost to himself, before looking at me with a faint hint of a smile. Interesting word choice. Then he turned back to her, his expression hardening again. The standard here, Karen, is the law. Not whatever rules you decide to invent. Karen's hands fidgeted with the strap of her handbag, her body language a stark contrast to the powerful stance she had marched in with minutes earlier. She looked smaller now, her voice weaker when she tried again to defend herself. If people are complaining, it's only because they don't understand the responsibilities I carry. They want everything their way. They don't see the big picture. I couldn't resist. No, Karen, the big picture is that you've been running this neighborhood like your personal kingdom, and now the king's court has finally caught up with you. Her eyes darted between us, desperate for an escape, some way to reclaim control. But there was none. The man across from me had dealt with politicians, executives, and people far more powerful than her. Her intimidation tactics, the ones she used to scare ordinary homeowners into silence, meant nothing here. The investigator finally leaned back, closing his notepad with a decisive snap. Karen, sit down. This conversation isn't over. You've spent years silencing your neighbors, but today, you're the one who will answer questions. Her lips trembled. For the first time since she barged in, Karen, the self-proclaimed ruler of the HOA, looked genuinely afraid. Karen sat down slowly, like the wooden chair beneath her had turned into a witness stand. Her oversized sunglasses slid halfway down her head, forgotten as she tried to steady herself. The sharp, commanding tone she usually used on neighbors was gone, replaced by a shaky silence. For years she had been the one handing out fines, barking orders, and threatening homeowners, but now she was facing a man who wasn't intimidated by her theatrics. My guest, the state investigator, didn't even raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm, steady tone carried far more weight than any of her loud accusations ever had. He opened his notepad again and began in the same controlled voice. Let's start simple. Where exactly are HOA funds being directed? Because according to several reports, large sums are being withdrawn for community improvements that don't seem to exist. Karen shifted uncomfortably, tugging at the strap of her bag. That's classified HOA business. Homeowners don't need to know every detail. They elected me to make decisions, and I. Karen, the investigator interrupted, his voice cutting through hers like a blade, this is not about what you think homeowners need to know. These funds are community property. And as president, you are responsible for every cent. If there's no transparency, that's mismanagement at best, and embezzlement at worst. Her face flushed crimson. Embezzlement? That's outrageous. I would never. I've spent hours, days, making sure this neighborhood stays perfect. Do you think that happens for free? I couldn't stop myself from chiming in. Perfect? Karen, people are terrified to live here because of you. I talked to a neighbor last week who said you fined him $300 because his lawn was half an inch too long. Another family told me you threatened to have their kids' bikes confiscated for being left on the driveway. That's not maintaining order, that's bullying. Karen snapped her head toward me, eyes narrowing, but she didn't lash out the way she normally would. Her words tumbled out weakly. Those were necessary. Rules are rules. If no one enforces them, the whole neighborhood falls apart. That's why I'm here, to keep property values up, to keep things controlled. The investigator tilted his head slightly. Controlled. That's an interesting choice of word. You see, most community associations exist to serve homeowners, not to dominate them. Yet according to the complaints, you've turned this HOA into your personal kingdom. Would you like to explain why fines were being issued for things that don't even exist in the official bylaws? Karen blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing. She tried to laugh, but it came out shaky. People exaggerate. They twist things. I only fine when it's necessary. They just don't understand the importance of uniformity. Without it, everything looks chaotic. That chaos lowers home values. I'm protecting them, even if they can't see it. The investigator scribbled something down, his expression unreadable. Interesting. And what about the reports of you entering people's properties without permission? Taking photographs through their windows? Issuing fines for curtain colors and barbecue times? Are those also necessary to prevent chaos? Karen's face went pale. She looked at me quickly, maybe hoping for some support, but all she got was my steady glare. I only did those things because if I didn't, no one else would. People need boundaries. They need someone to keep them in line. That's leadership. No, the investigator said, his tone sharp now, that's harassment. The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Karen flinched, her confidence slipping further. She fumbled with her handbag, pulling out a crumpled folder of her own and thrusting it onto the table. Here. These are my records. Proof that everything I've done is within reason. My guest calmly opened the folder, flipping through the papers. Most of them were handwritten notes, scraps of paper with scribbles about violations, none of them official documents. Some looked like they had been written on the back of grocery receipts. He set the folder down, unimpressed. Karen, this is not record keeping. This is obsession. Her voice grew shrill. No. No, you don't understand. If I don't enforce rules, people will take advantage. They'll paint their houses ridiculous colors, they'll park old junk cars in driveways, they'll build sheds that ruin the view of the lake. I'm the only one standing between order and chaos. I leaned forward, unable to hold back a laugh. Order? Or control? Because it seems to me you've confused the two. You don't want order, Karen. You want power. You thrive on scaring people. That's why you stormed in here today without knocking, without permission, because you believe rules don't apply to you. Her eyes widened, the truth hitting harder than any insult. For a second, she looked at me like she wanted to explode, but she glanced back at the investigator and swallowed her rage. She knew this wasn't just a neighborly spat anymore. This was official, and every word she spoke was digging her deeper. The investigator leaned forward, folding his hands. Karen, you're not untouchable. You may have intimidated your neighbors into silence, but the law doesn't bow to you. What you've been doing isn't leadership, it's abuse of authority. And today, you've crossed another line by barging into a private residence and interfering with a state investigation. Karen's lips trembled, and for the first time, she looked truly small. The mighty HOA president, who once walked through the community with her nose in the air, barking orders and leaving notes on doors, was sitting there like a child caught red-handed. She looked at me, then at him, then down at her trembling hands. I didn't mean, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I just wanted things to be right. But the words sounded hollow, even to her. The investigator sat back, jotting one last note in his pad. The problem, Karen, is that in trying to make things right, you forgot what was actually fair. And that is why you're here now, answering to someone you can't bully, threaten, or fine. The silence that followed was crushing. Karen stared at the table, her face pale, and for the first time in years, she had no power, no control, and no audience willing to bow down to her demands. Karen sat frozen in the chair, staring at the wooden table like it might swallow her whole. The investigator's words had cut through every layer of bravado she had built over the years, stripping her down to the truth she had tried so hard to hide. For years she had been feared, obeyed, and even whispered about in the community like some kind of self-crowned queen. But now? She looked less like a leader and more like a child caught sneaking cookies from the jar. The silence in the cabin stretched long and heavy, broken only by the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the corner. The investigator flipped his notepad closed with a sharp snap, and Karen flinched at the sound. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Karen, he said, his tone deliberate and calm, this investigation doesn't end here. I have more than enough to move forward, and after what I've witnessed today, your trespassing, your attempts to interfere, it only strengthens the case. I'll be forwarding everything to the state attorney's office. You should prepare yourself for what's coming. Her mouth opened as if to protest, but no sound came out. For once, Karen had no list of rules to recite, no threats to make, no fines to issue. She sat there, pale and trembling, clutching her handbag like it was a lifeline. You can't just ruin me like this, she finally whispered, her voice cracking. I've worked too hard. I've kept this place together. Without me, this neighborhood would fall apart. The investigator shook his head. No, Karen. The truth is, without you, this neighborhood might finally breathe again. Those words seemed to land heavier than anything else. She stood abruptly, muttering something about calling her lawyer, her movements clumsy, unsteady. She stormed toward the door the same way she had entered, but this time there was no fire in her step, no commanding presence. She looked smaller, defeated, as if the walls of authority she had built around herself had collapsed in an instant. The door slammed behind her, leaving a deep, echoing silence in her wake. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The investigator remained standing, his notepad tucked neatly under his arm, his face calm as ever. He didn't gloat, didn't celebrate, he didn't need to. He had seen this kind of downfall before. People who thought they were invincible, who built their power on intimidation and fear, always crumbled when faced with real accountability. Well, I said after a moment, letting a small smile tug at the corner of my mouth, that wasn't exactly how I planned this meeting to go. The investigator allowed himself the faintest of smiles in return. Sometimes, he said, people reveal more about themselves than any file or complaint ever could. She just handed me everything I needed. I nodded, glancing out the cabin window toward the lake. The water was calm, sunlight glittering on the ripples. For weeks I had heard whispers from neighbors about how suffocating it was to live under Karen's watchful eye. Parents were afraid to let their kids play outside, homeowners dreaded walking to their mailboxes, and simple joys like barbecues or porch lights had turned into battles with endless HOA notices. Now, for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope that all of that might change. The investigator packed his things neatly, sliding the folders back into his bag. "You'll want to keep a copy of your property records handy," he said. "I doubt she'll give up easily, but legally, she has no ground to stand on. From here, it's out of your hands. The state will take over." "Out of my hands," I repeated softly, feeling the weight of those words. For the first time since moving into the cabin, I didn't feel like I had to carry the burden of standing up to Karen alone. That evening, after the investigator left, I stepped out onto the porch with a cup of tea. The lake reflected the setting sun in shades of gold and orange, and for the first time, the silence felt like peace instead of tension. Neighbors walked by on the path near the water, and a few gave small nods or cautious waves. They must have heard the raised voices earlier, maybe even seen Karen storm in and out of my cabin. Word would spread fast, I knew that much. And maybe, just maybe, people would finally realize they didn't have to live under her thumb anymore. Over the next few days, the shift in the community was subtle but undeniable. Neighbors spoke more openly, conversations lasting longer at mailboxes and on porches. Kids rode their bikes down the street without parents anxiously shooing them inside. Someone even set up a small picnic by the lake without worrying that Karen would swoop in demanding permits. It was as if the air itself had lightened, like a heavy weight had been lifted. Karen, of course, tried to save face. She marched around the neighborhood the next morning, sunglasses on, chin high, pretending nothing had happened. But the whispers followed her. People weren't afraid to talk anymore. They knew the investigator had been in my cabin. They knew he had seen her for what she truly was. And the more she tried to pretend everything was normal, the more obvious it became that her reign was ending. By the end of the week, I heard that several homeowners had already contacted the state office directly, offering testimonies and records. The fear that had once kept them silent was gone, replaced by determination. Karen had ruled with intimidation for too long, and now that grip had finally loosened. One evening, as I stood on the dock watching the last light fade behind the trees, I thought back to that moment when she stormed into my cabin. She had walked in like she was untouchable, like the world revolved around her authority. But in her arrogance, she had walked straight into the one person who could dismantle everything she had built. She had exposed herself in the worst way possible. I sipped my tea and let a smile spread across my face. The lake was quiet, the air was crisp, and for the first time since I had moved here, I felt like this place truly belonged to me. Not to an HOA, not to a self-proclaimed queen, but to me, and to the neighbors who just wanted to live in peace. Karen's reign was over, even if she didn't fully realize it yet. And I knew one thing for certain, she would never forget the day she stormed into my cabin, only to freeze when she saw who was sitting at my table.